Welcome to Stories of Slumber, a quiet place where history softens and the ancient world returns in gentle whispers. Today, let us get into the story of Tokugawa Ieyasu, the shogun who built 250 years of peace. For 250 years, Japan slept in silence. Cities grew, art flourished. Generations lived and died without hearing the clash of swords that had once been as common as rain. This was the Edo period, the longest peace in Japanese history, and it was the creation of one man, a man who spent his childhood as a prisoner, his youth as a subordinate, and his middle years watching more ambitious men destroy themselves. His name was Tokugawa Ieyasu. But here is the question that echoes through centuries. How did a man born into endless violence create peace? And more troubling still, what kind of peace was it? What did Japan gain in those 2.5 centuries? And what did it lose? In a museum in Tokyo, there sits a small wooden writing box, plain, undecorated, the kind a minor lord might have owned. Inside, pressed between silk wrapping, are letters written in Ieyasu's own hand. The calligraphy is careful, measured, each stroke deliberate. Not the rushed scrawl of a warrior, but the patient work of someone who understood that words could accomplish what swords could not. The box survived wars, fires, centuries of change. The man who owned it built something that lasted even longer. In the year 1543, in the province of Mikawa, a child was born into a world that had forgotten peace. They called him Matsudaira Takechiyo. Mikawa lay in the heart of what is now the Kanto region, a stretch of fertile plains on the eastern coast of Honshu, Japan's main island. Good land, valuable land, contested land. This was the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states. Japan had been tearing itself apart for more than a century. There was no emperor with real power, no shogun who could command obedience. Instead, hundreds of daimyo, feudal lords fought endless wars. Alliances formed and shattered like spring ice. A domain that thrived one season could be ashes the next. The Matsudaira clan was small, vulnerable, trapped between two powers. To the west, the Oda clan grew stronger, ambitious and ruthless. To the east, the Imagawa commanded vast armies. Between them, the Matsudaira could only bend and hope not to break. When Takechiyo was 6 years old, his father sent him away. The arrangement was simple, brutal. The boy would live with the Imagawa as a hostage, a living promise of loyalty. If his father betrayed the alliance, the boy would die. Everyone understood this. It was how the world worked. But the journey east never reached its destination. The Oda clan intercepted the escort and took the boy for themselves. For 3 years, Takechiyo lived in Oda territory, a prisoner of his father's enemies. Then his father died, probably poisoned, and the boy became more valuable. The Imagawa negotiated his release, and at 9 years old, Takechiyo was moved to Sunpu, the Imagawa capital. He would spend the next decade there, a hostage in gilded rooms, watching, learning, surviving. Other boys might have grown bitter or broken. Takechiyo grew patient. He studied military strategy and swordsmanship. He observed the politics of the Imagawa court, how power flowed and shifted, how ambitious men made fatal mistakes. And he learned the most important lesson of his life, that waiting is not weakness, that the one who strikes first is not always the one who wins. The people of Mikawa in those days lived with war as their constant companion. Farmers worked fields that might be burned by passing armies. Merchants travelled roads where bandits were common. Children grew up knowing the sound of distant battles. They dreamed of stability the way drowning men dream of air. They could not know that the quiet boy in Sunpu was learning lessons that would one day give them exactly that. In the 5th month of 1560, everything changed. Imagawa Yoshimoto, confident and hungry for more, marched west with 25,000 men. His target was Kyoto, the ancient capital. Takechiyo, now 17 and called Matsudaira Motoyasu, rode with the vanguard. This was his first real campaign. The Imagawa army seemed unstoppable. But Oda Nobunaga, the young lord who held the territory they marched through, did something unexpected. He attacked. In a narrow gorge called Okehazama, during a thunderstorm, Nobunaga's 3,000 men fell upon Yoshimoto's headquarters. The great daimyo died in the mud. His army collapsed. For Motoyasu, the news arrived like lightning. His captor was dead. His lord was dead. He was free. But freedom in the Sengoku period was just another word for danger. He made his choice quickly. He took his small force and marched to Okazaki, his father's castle. He claimed what was his by blood. Then he sent a message to Oda Nobunaga proposing an alliance. It was the beginning of a partnership that would reshape Japan. Nobunaga was fire and ambition, a military genius who crushed anyone in his path. Motoyasu, who would soon take the name Ieyasu, was stone and calculation. Where Nobunaga burned, Ieyasu endured. For 20 years, Ieyasu grew stronger in Nobunaga's shadow. He fought when needed. He secured territories. He built loyalty through reliability, through keeping promises in a world where promises meant nothing. Other daimyo rose fast and fell faster. Ieyasu rose slowly, like a tree growing deep roots. Then, in 1582, in a temple in Kyoto, Nobunaga was betrayed by one of his own generals and forced to commit suicide. The news reached Ieyasu when he was far from home, in dangerous territory, with only a handful of men. He could have died that day. Instead, he made one of the legendary escapes of Japanese history, a desperate journey through mountain passes and hostile lands. He survived. He always survived. The question of who would inherit Nobunaga's vision hung over Japan like smoke. The answer came in Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a man who had risen from nothing to become Nobunaga's most brilliant general. Within a few years, Hideyoshi unified Japan. Every major daimyo either swore loyalty or was destroyed. Ieyasu made a choice that surprised everyone. He submitted to Hideyoshi. Not immediately, not without negotiation, but eventually he bent the knee. It looked like acceptance. Beneath that surface, it was calculation. Ieyasu recognized that challenging Hideyoshi would mean destruction, so he waited. When Hideyoshi, nervous about Ieyasu's power, offered him new territories in the east, far from Kyoto, Ieyasu accepted. Some saw it as exile disguised as reward. Ieyasu saw space. He saw potential. In 1590, he moved his headquarters to Edo, a small castle town on a marshy bay. It was nothing much. Ieyasu looked at it and saw the future. He transformed the landscape itself. He redirected rivers. He built roads and bridges. He encouraged merchants and craftsmen to settle. He created an administrative system that was efficient, predictable, loyal to him personally. While other daimyo played politics in Kyoto, Ieyasu built an engine of power in Edo. The city grew, markets appeared, workshops multiplied. What had been swampland became the foundation of something new. The people who came to Edo did not know they were building the future capital of Japan. They knew only that here, under Ieyasu's rule, contracts were honoured, debts were paid, justice was predictable. In a world of chaos, this was worth more than gold. The story of how Ieyasu learned patience begins in the gardens of the Imagawa estate in Sunpu. Young Takechio would sit by a stone lantern beside a koi pond in the early mornings. One morning after a night of rain, he noticed a spider rebuilding its web between two branches of a maple tree. The storm had destroyed every thread, but the spider was already at work, beginning again from the centre. The boy watched for hours. The spider moved with perfect patience, each thread placed precisely. When wind destroyed one section, the spider started that section over. By the time his tutor came looking for him, the web was complete again, glistening with dew, as if the storm had never happened. Years later, when people asked how he survived as a hostage for so long, Ieyasu would sometimes mention the spider. Not its strength, but its refusal to accept defeat as final. The understanding that destruction is temporary, but patience can rebuild anything. That patience became the foundation of everything Ieyasu accomplished. And nowhere was it more evident than at a place called Sekigahara. Hideyoshi died in 1598. He left behind a 5-year-old son and a request that the most powerful daimyo, the Council of 5 Elders, would protect the boy and govern until he came of age. Ieyasu was one of these 5. In fact, he was the most powerful, with the most land, the most loyal retainers, the strongest economy. Everyone knew what would happen next. The question was not whether Ieyasu would make a play for supreme power. The question was how and who would try to stop him. Japan divided. Some daimyo supported Hideyoshi's son. Others saw opportunity. Ieyasu's main rival was Ishida Mitsunari, a brilliant administrator who commanded the loyalty of the Western daimyo. In October 1600, more than 150,000 men met in the valley of Sekigahara. It was the largest battle fought in Japan up to that time. On paper, the forces were evenly matched. In reality, the battle was over before it began. Ieyasu had made secret agreements with several generals in Mitsunari's army. Not all of them, just enough. The key was Kobayakawa Hideaki, whose forces held high ground overlooking the battlefield. Kobayakawa had promised to betray Mitsunari at the crucial moment. But as the battle began, Kobayakawa did nothing. His troops stayed on the mountain, watching. Hours passed. The fighting was savage, inconclusive. Ieyasu could feel the moment slipping away. So he did something that became legendary. He ordered his gunners to fire on Kobayakawa's position. Not a full volley, just enough shots to send a message. A reminder of who held the real power. The message was received. Kobayakawa gave the signal, and his 15,000 men charged down the mountain into Mitsunari's flank. The Western army collapsed. Mitsunari fled, was captured, was executed. Sekigahara gave Ieyasu control of Japan. It was not victory through superior force. It was victory through preparation, through understanding that battles are won before the first sword is drawn. The spider rebuilding its web, thread by patient thread, until the structure could hold. But one threat remained. Hideyori, Hideyoshi's son, was still alive, still a potential rival. For 14 years, Ieyasu waited. He became shogun in 1603, receiving the title from the emperor. He built, he organized. He created systems of control that made rebellion almost impossible. But Hideyori remained, living in Osaka Castle, a symbol of what might have been. Finally, in 1614, when Ieyasu was 72 and Hideyori was 21, the patience ended. The pretext was minor, an inscription on a temple bell that could be read as an insult. The reality was that Hideyori had been gathering ronin, masterless samurai, building an army. 200,000 men surrounded Osaka, the greatest fortress in Japan. Walls 50 feet high, moats 100 feet wide, defended by 100,000 warriors. The winter siege lasted months. The castle held. Then Ieyasu offered peace. Very reasonable terms. Hideyori, exhausted, accepted. Part of the agreement was that the outer moats would be filled in. This seemed fair. The moats were filled. Summer came, and with it Ieyasu's army returned. Without the outer defences, Osaka Castle was vulnerable. The summer siege was shorter, more brutal. The walls were breached. Hideyori and his mother committed suicide as the castle burned. The last threat to Tokugawa power died in that fire, but something else died there too. At Osaka, Ieyasu proved he would destroy anything to preserve the peace he was building. The message was clear. Resistance was not just futile, it was unthinkable. A merchant in Edo, watching smoke rise from the direction of Osaka, wrote in his diary that he felt relief and sadness in equal measure. Relief that the wars might finally end, sadness that they ended this way, with such finality, such absolute power in the hands of one family. He did not write what he truly thought. In the new Japan taking shape, some thoughts were better left unrecorded. Japan had a choice: accept the order Ieyasu offered, or cease to exist. Most of Japan chose to live. The machinery of peace began to turn. The Tokugawa Shogunate was not simply a government. It was an architecture of control so comprehensive that rebellion became almost impossible to imagine. The foundation was the Sankin Kotai system. Every daimyo in Japan was required to maintain 2 residences, one in their home domain and one in Edo. They would spend alternating years in each location. When a daimyo left Edo, his wife and heir remained behind as hostages. The system was expensive, deliberately so. Maintaining 2 households, funding the travel, all of this drained the treasuries of the daimyo. They could maintain their domains, but they could never accumulate enough wealth to fund a rebellion. The roads were carefully monitored. Checkpoints recorded every traveller. The entire country became a prison so comfortable that most people never noticed the bars. Ieyasu also froze Japanese society into 4 rigid classes. At the top, the samurai. Below them, the farmers. Then the artisans. At the bottom, the merchants. No one could change classes. A farmer's child would be a farmer forever. The system was called Shi no Kosho. A boy in a village near Kyoto, brilliant with numbers, dreamed of becoming a scholar. He learned to read in secret, borrowed books, taught himself calculations that merchants used, but he was born a farmer. When he approached a local samurai about education, The samurai looked at him with something like pity and told him to return to his fields. The boy did. He married, had children, taught them to plant rice. His gift died in the mud where he was born. Then came Sakoku, the closed country policy. Christianity was banned. Foreign trade was restricted to a single port, Nagasaki. Japanese people were forbidden from leaving the country, forbidden from building ocean-going ships. Japan became isolated in time, cut off from the changes sweeping through the rest of the world. The stated reason was stability. The real reason was control. Outside ideas were dangerous. A Japan that looked inward was a Japan that could not imagine alternatives to Tokugawa rule. Ieyasu retired in 1605, giving the title of shogun to his son, ensuring smooth succession. He died in 1616, at 73, having accomplished what no one before him had managed. He had brought peace to Japan. Total, absolute, unchangeable peace. For 250 years, Japan saw no civil war, no major rebellions. People lived longer, more safely than they had in centuries. Culture flourished. The arts of tea ceremony and flower arrangement became sophisticated beyond anything previously imagined. Woodblock prints captured the beauty of everyday life. Poets refined haiku to perfect simplicity. Theatre evolved into forms that still captivate audiences today. Edo grew into one of the largest cities in the world, with 1 million people by the 18th century. The Tokugawa peace was real, substantial, meaningful. A farmer could plant crops knowing they would harvest them. A merchant could travel knowing the roads were safe. A child could grow old without ever seeing a battlefield. For people who remembered the Sengoku period, or whose grandparents remembered, this was a miracle. But it was also a cage. The samurai class, trained for war, now had nothing to fight. They became bureaucrats, philosophers, men who wore swords they would never draw. The rigid class system meant that brilliance and ambition had nowhere to go. Innovation slowed, then stopped. The price of peace was freedom. The price of stability was growth. And the price of isolation was that when the world finally came knocking, Japan had no answer. The world outside Japan's closed doors was changing. In Europe and America, the age of industry was beginning. Steam engines, railroads, factories that produced goods at scales previously unimaginable. The technology of war advanced with terrifying speed. Ships made of iron, cannons that could destroy fortresses from miles away. And more than that, ideas were changing. Democracy, human rights, the notion that people could choose their governments, that power came from the governed, not from heaven. These ideas were dangerous to any system built on rigid hierarchy. The Tokugawa Shogunate depended on everyone accepting their place, never questioning, never imagining alternatives. The Japanese knew vaguely that the outside world existed. Dutch traders at Nagasaki brought news, carefully filtered. But the official position was that Japan needed nothing from outside. Japan was complete, perfect, self-sufficient. This belief persisted so long it became almost religious. The system was not preparing Japan for anything. It was preserving Japan in amber, perfect and unchanging and fragile. Like a garden that is never pruned, growing inward on itself, beautiful and dying. The first cracks appeared in the early 19th century. Russian ships probed the northern borders. British and American ships began appearing off the coast. The shogunate refused every request, sometimes violently. But the ships kept coming. Then on July 8th, 1853, 4 black ships appeared in Edo Bay. American warships under Commodore Matthew Perry, carrying a letter demanding that Japan open its ports to trade. The ships were steam-powered, armed with modern cannon that could destroy any Japanese fort from distances Japanese guns could not reach. Perry was polite, but the threat was obvious. Open your ports, or we will open them for you. The shogunate had no answer. Perry returned in 1854 with more ships, and Japan agreed. The Treaty of Kanagawa opened 2 ports. Within years, similar treaties were signed with Britain, Russia, France. The closed country was forced open. The Tokugawa shogunate suddenly looked weak, outdated, incapable of protecting Japan. The emperor, who had been a figurehead for centuries, became a rallying point for those who wanted change. Young samurai, frustrated by the rigid system, channeled their energy into politics, into violence. The peace that Ieyasu built began to crack. In 1867, the last Tokugawa shogun resigned. The emperor was restored to power, at least symbolically. A new government formed, led by reformers who understood that Japan had to modernize or be colonized. The Meiji Restoration began the transformation of Japan from a feudal society to an industrial power. Within 50 years, Japan would have railroads, telegraph lines, a modern military. It would win wars against China and Russia, shocking the world. The country that had slept for 2.5 centuries woke with desperate speed, racing to catch up to a world that had left it behind. The long sleep was over, but what had been lost in those sleeping years could never be recovered. The time when Japan might have engaged with the world on its own terms, learned gradually, adapted naturally, but time was gone. Instead, modernization came as trauma, a forced transformation that tore apart the social fabric Ieyasu had woven so carefully. Tokugawa Ieyasu died more than 200 years before the black ships arrived, but his shadow fell across that moment. The peace he created was real, but it was also chains that bound Japan when the world changed around it. This is the paradox at the heart of his legacy. He ended war and created peace, but the peace was built on control so complete, isolation so total, that it made Japan vulnerable in ways no one anticipated. If Japan had not closed itself off, would it have been better prepared? Would Japanese merchants have built ships and sailed their own seas, learning what the world was learning? Would scholars have engaged with Western science, adapting what was useful, rejecting what was not? We cannot know. History does not offer alternative versions. What happened is that Ieyasu's peace lasted exactly as long as the world allowed it. When that world arrived with ships of iron and guns of steel, the system could not adapt because adaptation had been designed out of it. Yet there is something to learn from the man himself. Ieyasu survived a childhood that should have destroyed him, captivity that should have broken him. He survived by learning patience, by understanding that power is not always visible, by knowing when to wait and when to strike. The spider rebuilding its web, the strategist who lets his enemies destroy themselves. The architect who builds slowly for a future only he can see. But there is a darker lesson too, that security can become stagnation, that order can become oppression, that the attempt to create a perfect, unchanging world is itself a kind of violence. Ieyasu created peace by ending possibility. He gave Japan stability by taking away its future. The system collapsed not because it was weak, but because it was too strong, too perfect. It had no room for the adaptations that let living things survive in a changing world. It was a castle with walls so high that no one inside could see what was coming. Perhaps the real question is not how Ieyasu created peace. Perhaps the question is whether that peace was worth what it cost. Whether a nation that sleeps for 2.5 centuries is really alive at all. Or whether it has simply postponed the moment when it must wake and face the world as it is. The answer depends on what you value: safety or freedom, stability or growth, the comfort of knowing your place, or the terror and possibility of a world where anything might change. Ieyasu chose for Japan. He chose peace. He chose order. He chose a long, quiet sleep. And when Japan finally woke, the world had moved on. But for 250 years, the wars ended. The killing stopped. Families lived in the same houses, the same villages, worked the same trades their ancestors had worked. There is something to be said for that, something precious, even if it came at a cost almost too high to bear. We face similar questions today. We build systems meant to keep us safe, to give us stability, to protect us from chaos. But every system that promises perfect safety also limits what we might become. Every wall built high enough to keep danger out also keeps possibility in. Ieyasu understood that the spider must rebuild its web after every storm, but he forgot that the spider also changes where it builds, adapts to new conditions, learns from what destroys it. He built a web so perfect that it could never be rebuilt differently. And when the storm finally came, it could not hold. The writing box sits in its glass case. The letters inside speak of negotiations, of alliances, of patience. Around it, Tokyo moves, a city of millions, built on the foundation of Edo, the town Ieyasu made into a capital. The spider rebuilds its web, the warrior becomes a peacemaker, the hostage becomes the architect of a nation's longest dream. How does a man born into endless violence create peace? The answer, whispered across centuries, is this: carefully, ruthlessly, and with patience that outlasts empires. But what kind of peace it is, and what it costs, that answer belongs to those who live in it, who wait from it, who must decide what to build in its place. The wind moves through the city, silent, waiting. And in that silence, perhaps, the echo of Ieyasu's choice lingers still.